Now, these are obviously improper redactions.
And let me stop for a minute.
I'm talking.
No.
I'm
if they're
talking.
Not privileged,
quiet.
Don't yell at me. If they're not
Mr. Chairman, would you stop the clock? This is on your time. It's not on Mr. Goldman.
They're not
Even
privileged,
though you used your improper redactions,
you'll like my answer.
To continue to protect.
Let me start with something simple, just a show of hands. How many of you, or someone close to you, has actually sat down with the Department of Justice and delivered testimony, shared estimates, and presented evidence? Not a single one. Now, since none of you were granted that opportunity, how many took the initiative, personally or through an attorney or representative, to reach out and offer your testimony and proof? Every one of you, and of those who made that effort, how many were turned away or met with silence by the Department of Justice? All of you. Yet even after the disgraceful attempts by Ms. Bondi and her office to pressure and discourage you, how many remain ready and willing to speak openly with the Department of Justice? Without exception, every one of you. Well, Ms. Bondi, it seems you may have a few more witnesses to hear from, and with that, I yield back. Just minutes ago, in a tense exchange before the House Judiciary Committee, Congressman Dan Goldman rose from his seat holding a single sheet of paper, one document that carried more weight than volumes of testimony. It was an email from Jeffrey Epstein to Ghislaine Maxwell. In Epstein's own words, the message referenced statements Donald Trump had made about his relationship with him. The document is real. It sits in the Department of Justice's files. But when Goldman displayed it, the page told two stories, one in ink and one in shadow. Large portions were obscured, thick black redactions concealing critical passages. The visible text raised questions, the hidden lines raised even more. Goldman pressed Bondi directly, calling for the full, unredacted version to be released so the American public could judge the truth for themselves and measure the accuracy of Trump's claims. Bondi did not provide an answer. Instead of addressing the document, she went after Goldman himself. What followed was not a routine back and forth. It was a confrontation that spiraled into raised voices, with Goldman forcefully demanding that she be quiet as she continued speaking over him. In that moment, the focus shifted from a single redacted email to something much larger. What stood exposed wasn't just blacked-out text on a page, it was the appearance of a system closing ranks, of scrutiny met with hostility instead of transparency, and it was a congressman unwilling to let the issue be brushed aside. I followed congressional hearings for years. Heated rhetoric, that's normal. Witnesses dodging uncomfortable questions, that happens all the time. But watching a sitting attorney general respond to evidence suggestive of a cover-up by attacking the very person presenting it, and then being publicly rebuked when she refused to yield the floor, was something else entirely. It wasn't just contentious, it was revealing. It was February 11, 2026. 5 hours into a grueling House Judiciary Committee oversight hearing, Attorney General Bondi was still at the witness table. In the gallery behind her sat survivors of Jeffrey Epstein's abuse, dressed in white shirts stamped with a stark message, words partially blacked out, mimicking the redactions that have come to define their long wait for answers. "The truth is the slogan read, cut off deliberately, a visual reminder that their stories remain incomplete in the public record. Cameras framed every angle of the room. The tension was unmistakable. Then came Dan Goldman, former federal prosecutor, lead counsel during Donald Trump's first impeachment, now a congressman from New York. He wasn't there to debate abstract principles or trade political talking points. In his hand was a specific document, an email his own Department of Justice had already released, yet heavily obscured beneath thick black lines. It wasn't speculation, it wasn't rumor, it was documented evidence, traceable, verifiable, real. As his questioning unfolded, the temperature in the room rose. Goldman pressed for clarity on the redactions, on who decided what the public could see and what would remain hidden. By the time his allotted minutes expired, the hearing had dissolved into open shouting. What triggered the eruption wasn't theatrics, it was the implication that the selective concealment of names followed a discernible pattern, one that no one present could easily dismiss. To understand why that moment mattered, you have to rewind to December 2025. That was when the Department of Justice released millions of pages from the Epstein files, complying with the Epstein Files Transparency Act. The volume was staggering. But as survivors and lawmakers combed through the documents, a troubling consistency emerged. The identities of victims appeared in clear view, while the names of influential men were frequently masked behind redaction bars. The imbalance didn't go unnoticed, and it set the stage for the confrontation that would unfold 2 months later. Billionaires were identified as alleged co-conspirators, at least in part. Entire communications referencing specific individuals were reduced to black ink, line after line redacted, context erased, meaning obscured. Buried deep within that mountain of documents was an email from Epstein to Maxwell that referenced Donald Trump. It didn't jump out at first glance. It had to be found. Goldman's staff uncovered it during a meticulous document review, combing through page after page of heavily edited material. When Goldman examined the sections that remained visible, the significance became immediately clear. Even in its incomplete form, the message contradicted Trump's public claims about the nature of his relationship with Epstein. And if the concealed portions reinforced what the visible text suggested, then the full, unredacted version would be politically explosive. Now picture the scene. Late afternoon in the Rayburn House office building. The hearing room air feels heavy after 5 relentless hours. Lawmakers are tired, staffers are whispering behind stacks of binders, and the gallery remains filled with survivors who have sat through every minute. Throughout the day, Democrats have pressed Bondi on the logic behind the redactions, on references to missing materials, on why survivors say their outreach has been ignored. Each time, Bondi has sidestepped. She has countered criticism with criticism, responded to probing questions with sharp retorts, and redirected the conversation toward safer territory, economic indicators, crime data, talking points far removed from the documents in question. But the email Goldman held was different. It wasn't a broad accusation or a hypothetical scenario. It was a specific record, released by her own department, partially visible, yet partially concealed. And in that charged room, after hours of deflection and diversion, the stakes of what remained hidden felt heavier than ever. Thomas Massie had already confronted her over the concealment of Les Wexner's name, flagged in the files as a co-conspirator, only to be dismissed as a failed politician. When Ted Lieu pressed her about reports of Trump attending parties with Epstein and underage girls, she waved it off as absurd. The pattern was no longer subtle. Any inquiry that connected Trump to Epstein was met not with clarification, but with a counterattack. Then it was Dan Goldman's turn. He didn't begin with a sweeping statement. He didn't posture for headlines. He approached the exchange the way a seasoned prosecutor approaches a cross-examination, methodically, deliberately, evidence first. Attorney General Bondi, Goldman said, lifting a document into view. I want to direct your attention to something from the files your department released. The paper was visible to the room and to the cameras. A single sheet marked by thick black redactions. The atmosphere shifted instantly. This wasn't the routine hush of procedural formality. It was the strained silence of a room sensing that a line was about to be crossed, that the next few minutes might cut through hours of evasion. Staffers stopped whispering. Lawmakers leaned forward. Even the gallery seemed to hold its breath. Because this time, it wasn't a hypothetical. It wasn't partisan rhetoric. It was a document originating from within her own department, now placed squarely at the center of the hearing. Goldman pressed forward, his tone steady, controlled. This is an email from Jeffrey Epstein to Ghislaine Maxwell, he said, holding the page at eye level. Based on the portions your department chose not to redact, the message references statements Donald Trump made about his previous relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. He stopped speaking. Not because he had lost his place, but because he wanted the weight of that fact to settle over the room. An email, written by Epstein, sent to his closest associate, discussing Trump's own public comments about their relationship. Goldman lifted the document higher, angling it toward the cameras so the country watching at home could see it for themselves. As you can observe, he continued, significant sections of this email have been redacted. Thick black bars stretched across the page, concealing entire paragraphs. The visible fragments hinted at context, the concealed sections held the rest of the story. The American people, Goldman said evenly, cannot read what Jeffrey Epstein wrote regarding Donald Trump's statements. Another pause. Precise, intentional. So my question is straightforward. Will you commit to releasing the unredacted version of this email to the public so they can fully evaluate the accuracy of Donald Trump's claims about his relationship with Jeffrey Epstein? And then he stopped. No follow-up. No embellishment. Just the question, clear, direct, impossible to misunderstand, hanging in the silence. Listen to the structure of that question. He didn't ask her to explain departmental procedure. He didn't wander into a debate about general transparency standards. He didn't invite a policy lecture. The question was narrow, controlled, binary. Will you release the unredacted email? Yes or no? Not theory, not rhetoric. Evidence. If you're beginning to see the significance of that moment, you understand why it landed the way it did. This wasn't about partisan sparring. It was about whether the public would be allowed to read words already sitting inside DOJ files, words that could confirm or contradict a former president's claims, and then Bondi responded, but she didn't respond to the substance of the question. Instead, she pivoted instantly. You are about as good of a lawyer today as you were when you tried to impeach President Trump in 2019, she shot back. Have you apologized for that? It was immediate, personal, calculated, not an explanation of the redactions, not a defense of departmental policy, not a commitment to transparency. A counterattack. It was the classic maneuver of someone who cannot or will not engage the evidence placed in front of them, shift the focus, question the questioner, turn the spotlight away from the document and onto the person holding it. In that split second, the exchange stopped being about an email and became about something else entirely. Why the question couldn't be answered. Goldman didn't flinch. Attorney General, he said, steady but firm, I asked you a yes or no question. Will you release the unredacted email? Bondi didn't pause. She launched into a counterattack. Congressman, you have spent years attacking this president with false accusations. Goldman tried to interrupt. She kept talking over him. And now you want to lecture on transparency when you said nothing while Merrick Garland... Goldman's voice rose, sharper this time. Will you answer the question? Still, Bondi pressed on, pivoting to unrelated topics, attacking his record, bringing in the Biden administration, shifting the focus away from the email in front of her. And then Goldman did something that stunned everyone in the hearing room. He shouted one word, clear, loud, unambiguous, cutting through the deflection. The word struck the room, halting Bondi mid-sentence. For the first time in hours, the room held its collective breath. The question, simple, direct, unavoidable, was finally forced back into focus. The room exploded. Not applause, not cheers, chaos. Members scrambled in their seats. Chairman Jim Jordan slammed the gavel, shouting for order. Reporters typed frantically. Survivors in the gallery stood, some with hands over their mouths, stunned at what had just happened. It was unprecedented. A congressman, a former federal prosecutor intimately familiar with how the DOJ operates, had just shouted down the Attorney General of the United States in the middle of her deflection. And he did it for one reason. She refused to answer a direct question about evidence showing that Donald Trump lied about Jeffrey Epstein. Goldman wasn't finished. As the room settled, barely, he repeated the question, crisp and relentless. Attorney General Bondi, yes or no? Will you release the unredacted version of the email from Jeffrey Epstein to Ghislaine Maxwell discussing Donald Trump's statements about their relationship? Bondi's face tightened. Every line showed calculation. She could answer honestly and admit she wouldn't release it. That would confirm a cover-up. She could commit to releasing it and expose Trump. Or she chose a third option. Congressman, there are legal standards that govern redactions in these files, and I am not going to sit here and be lectured by someone who... Goldman cut her off. That wasn't a yes. That wasn't compliance. That was a refusal. The American people should understand this clearly. The Attorney General just refused to release evidence that directly contradicts President Trump's public statements about Jeffrey Epstein.